Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Image for All webinar, Faith, Religion and Mental Health. It's really good to be here, and I'm glad you're taking the time to come with us and to think with us together. It's a global audience, so I'd like to welcome you from wherever you are in the world. I'm in what's a rather sunny Aberdeen in Scotland, which is rather nice. But the people that are in this webinar, we're all from different and diverse backgrounds, professions, countries, and we come together to really discuss some important issues. But we come together as friends, as people who want to learn, as fellow travelers. So it's going to be a peaceable conversation, but hopefully it'll be a very interesting conversation. I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat. Give us a sense of who you are, your name, your organization, your country. Really nice just to think about what it means for us all to know where we're coming from in that sense. We're going to have a really interesting conversation, but we want you to participate in it. So as we're going along, if you have questions that you want to ask or things that you want the panel to respond to, let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible of the questions that you asked us. So let's think about the context for today. The relationship between faith and religion is complicated. It's always been complicated for a number of different reasons, and it differs across cultures. The way that people experience mental health challenges in the United Kingdom, where I am, is very often different from the way that people experience them in the United States or in India or Korea. So that this global conversation is really, really important because we can't afford just to look at our own situations. We need to open up that space so we can really know and understand what goes on across cultures. Now, positively, faith offers structure, community, resilience, meaning, and there's some really interesting research that suggests that faith can be good for your mental health because it prevents you from doing certain things such as taking substances that will harm you. It gives you a sense of community. It gives you a sense of importance and centrality of who you are in the world and what your identity is. There are, of course, challenges. Certain religious beliefs can induce guilt, fear, stigma, spiritual abuse. And these problematic dimensions of faith are really important, and we hope to be able to discuss something of that today. There's also a very interesting scientific body of literature that's begun to develop in relation to faith and health, suggesting that, as I say, it is good for your mental health. But there's an interesting challenge in the midst of that, and that's this. When we measure spirituality scientifically, we have to break it down into behaviors. Does this behavior bring well-being? Does this behavior bring damage? And one of the questions that we may want to think about is that does a scientific exploration of spirituality remove the transcendent, remove the thing that makes it special? And so there's all these interesting positive aspects and interesting challenges. But the key question for our discussion is this: how can we harness the benefits of faith for well-being while also addressing the spiritual harms or potential harms? And we have some wonderful panelists with us today. And I'm going to ask you panelists to just to introduce yourself, to give everybody a sense of who you are and why you're interested in this particular area. And Julie, if we could begin with you, that would be great.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Dr. Julie Radlauer. I am the CEO of an organization called Collectively. I also teach at the University of South Florida. I'm in the United States. And my experience is mainly with children and families who are struggling with their mental health. And I focus specifically in low socioeconomic communities. I speak about religion and spirituality and the impact in terms of creating community and the impact of stigma and how stigma affects relationships with religious organizations. That's me.
Thank you. Abdifatah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, everyone, and thanks, and Dr. John, Professor John. And my name is Dr. Abdifatah. I'm a clinical psychologist by profession, and I am from Somaliland, a part of and independent from the rest of Somalia. I am working in a community which is mainly conservative, and recently I have been exposed to a new paradigm in psychology. We call it an Islamic psychology. So I have seen some useful and tools or content that can help for the people for the Somali society and regarding mental health, and especially which can remove the misconception about psychology or psychiatric for our community and become a bridge for introducing them to mental health. So that's what I came to this area of mental health and religion, the relationship between them.
That's great. Thank you very much. Manoj.
Thank you, John. My name is Manoj Kurian. I'm a medical doctor trained in community health. I'm from Malaysia, of Indian origin, and spent many years in India. I'm based in Geneva with the World Council of Churches, and I am the director of the Church's Commission on Health and Healing. And mental health is one of the four priorities of the WCC, and we are passionately, working to mobilize churches to be useful, and to mobilize their capacities to be useful in public health.
That's great. Interesting group of people. I'm John Swinton. I'm Professor in Practical Theology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And I'm a former mental health nurse, and I now research mainly in the area of theology and mental health. So, just to begin the conversation, one of the things that we all know is that within the West, there is a split between religion and spirituality. So, once upon a time, faith would have meant primarily religion. Now it means faith. It means faith. It means religion and this thing called spirituality. But it's not always clear what this thing called spirituality is. So let me ask you the first question: why do you think this split is happening? And how do different faith traditions understand this distinction between religion and spirituality? Um, we could begin with you, Manoj.
Yeah, I think this, in my understanding, spirituality is the ability to go beyond yourself, and to be sensitive and to be connected to others and to creation around you. So and of course, religion is, practices and beliefs which binds you to spirituality,
Right.
and makes you more sensitive and responsive. When the practice of religion becomes detached from being helpful to others and become very limited, then people drift away, and they're not, if they're not able to relate these practices with their to face the day-to-day challenges, they drift away. So of course, there is a tendency to say that there is increase in reduction in spirituality, increase in reduction in religiosity, increase in spirituality,
Mhm.
which is debatable actually, because what do you mean by spirituality? Just doing meditation, or doing exercise? If that actually prepares you to be more sensitive and connected, it could make you more spiritual. So it is debatable, but I think religions and faith communities should be always be alert to be to check and ask themselves, are we being useful in the area of mental health? Are we actually
Right.
reducing loneliness? Are we actually helping people to be more resilient? So if not, then why not? Then the usefulness of religion declines, and people drift away. Thank you.
No, that's interesting. So you think a contribution that religion could make is to help people to find these things and to give them that sense of meaning and purpose. That's very good. Julie.
Well, thank you for that. I think so. A research study that I conducted, we interviewed families from across the country, African American families, and asked them about their experiences in their faith communities. And if they felt that these were families that have experience with mental health conditions, and asked them if the faith communities supported their mental health. And overwhelmingly, the results were that faith communities did not support their mental health. That in this particular population, being when they were speaking about their mental health to their pastors and to their faith communities, the response was, well, you're not praying properly or you're not praying enough. And that's why you're experiencing the mental health. And so that led families to feel that they are not getting supported through their religion, and they practice their faith and their spirituality outside of the religious experience. So 100% of the people that we interviewed said that they are very spiritual or faithful, is the language they use, is faithful, but that they did not practice their religion because they didn't feel welcome in the church space. So we took that information and we connected with the pastors and said, this is the information that we're getting. What do you do to talk about mental health? And then worked with pastors to educate them about mental health so that they felt more comfortable and understood what mental health means to some people. And, the physiology, the biology of it, recognizing that it's a brain disorder, just this basic education about mental health, and found that then they did actually increase their willingness and welcoming people into faith communities. So I think, and this was also, this particular study was around the time of COVID, right after COVID. So many people were really struggling with their mental health. And many of the pastors were also struggling in terms of so many people had so many needs and they didn't have the resources to support them from a mental health perspective. So it was very welcomed by them to have this additional access to information and resources that they could share, support the people that they're working with. One thing that we do recognize, and to your point, John, you mentioned it, is that, faith offers an opportunity for community.
Yeah.
And being in spaces together. And so if you don't feel like you can go to church, temple, mosque, whatever that is, because you're not welcomed there, then you miss that opportunity for community, which then does increase loneliness, which leads to mental health. And so I know in the US, there's a decrease in participation in faith-based community in person, that third space, so to speak, which then is one of the indicators of why we're struggling so much with mental health.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Daud.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think when it comes here in Islam or in the Somali context, and that and separation of religion and spirituality is not yet there. And there are two things here. One is the Islam, the institution, and one is the Muslims who are practicing the Islamic teaching. So when we see the Islam perspective, the perspective of Islam, religion and spirituality are interconnected. You cannot do anything under the umbrella of Islam without following two criteria. One of the criteria is to accept the oneness of Allah, of God, and the second is to follow the teaching of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which is the Quran, which is revelation from God, and the second is the Sunnah, which is what the Prophet said or did. So anything deviated from these two criteria in Islam is not call it and under the institution of Islam. So when we see under the Islam, spirituality is comes on the levels of of religious practices.
Mhm.
There are three levels of religious practices. One is a Muslim. When we call someone is a Muslim, is the lowest level, which is the person is submitting his will to God, and the person is practicing the basic and tenets of Islam. And the second, which is a bit deeper than the Islam, is called mu'min. Mu'min is a faithful believer. The person is not only doing ritual, the person internalizes the belief, and there are criteria of belief which you have to internalize it. And the third one, which in Islam we call the spirituality, is called muhsin. This person is a person who is a much deep in the religion, transcendent, feeling transcendent, and even the definition of muhsin or spirituality in Islam is
Mhm.
to worship on Allah by feeling that you are seeing Him. If you are not seeing Him, you know that He is seeing you. So you are doing all the rituals and whatever you are doing under the impression that Allah is watching you. So in Islam, we call that is the level of spirituality.
That's
So
really helpful.
all the criterion, all the levels must come under the two and, and requirements which I mentioned. But when it comes for the Muslims are and here in our society, you can see, though we will discuss maybe later, you can find a bit difference. When you
Mhm.
see in Islam, the religious abuses are not as such. But when you take the use of the practicing of the Islamic teaching,
Yeah.
then the problem is coming,
Okay.
which will be which is different from country to country, all the Muslims.
That's great. That's really helpful. So, if I'm hearing everybody properly, Julie, you're saying that relationships are fundamentally important and community is fundamentally important, but at the same time, it's beginning to fragment because we have a kind of individualistic culture. But the church itself, which should be a community, isn't grasping the issues as it should do or creating the kind of community it does. You and I are saying that uh, we should think practically about these things. Think about the outcome of our theology and the outcome of our practice in relation to mental health, rather than thinking in concepts and ideas. And I think what you said there about Islam is really important because the idea that spirituality and religion are separate things seems to me quite a Western idea. That within the Islamic traditions that you're talking about, there's no separation. Your religion is your spirituality. And you're not searching for meaning because Allah is meaning in that sense. So there's some interesting cultural tensions there, which I think are worth thinking about. And it kind of takes me to my second question, which is in relation to the research. So there's a lot of research on spirituality, mental health, and that's a good thing. Um, but it does tend to be very Eurocentric, right? So the definitions of spirituality that people work with tend to be things like meaning and purpose, value and hope, and for some people, God. So it's big, broad definitions which work well within the kind of context that Julie's talking about, but may not work well in the kind of context that Daud's talking about. So my question just basically is, do you think that A, research is important, scientific research is important, and B, that it is overly Eurocentric? And if I can begin with you, Julie, that'd be good because I know you do research.
I think the answer is yes.
Good,
I,
good question.
I really, yeah, listening to what Abdifatah said, and absolutely, yeah, we do in the West measure, the positive impacts of religion in space, putting people in, through brain scans to recognize the impact of when they're praying, and there are all kinds of studies that
Yeah.
do show the positive impacts of, religion, religiosity, spirituality, prayer, all of everything that you're discussing. So, from a scientific research evidence space, it tracks
Yeah,
that it's beneficial. But
yeah,
I can't imagine then overlaying the process that's used in the U.S. in other places. So I
no,
feel like your answer is definitely a yes on that one.
that's interesting. Yeah, Manoj, what do you think in that on that question?
The evidence and scientific understanding is very important because you see, in all the faiths and faith traditions, you will find that in at each age, there were people they had engaged in dialogue
Mm,
with the most advanced people. So their interpretations, be it in the Hindu scriptures or the Islamic or Christian or Shinto, you find commentaries. What it shows historically is that they engaged with the latest information that was known to them. So evidence is very important. So if you look at public health, if you look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's a very very updated document when it was written with the science at that time. So we are obligated to engage with the evidence. But you truly raise the issue of that, if the scientific knowledge is generated in one region, it becomes very, very much skewed. It is skewed. Because when I was trying to, I was doing some research on the influence of prayer on mental health. You
yes.
know, and I found it quite difficult actually to get good research with it because if you look at the taxonomy of prayer, there are various aspects of prayer. It is not just it's adoration, praise, and confession, thanksgiving, supplication, obligatory prayer. There is also a kind of a prayer which is not defined. Where we just in meditation. So various aspects, and you don't get much of disaggregated information. Research has not been done in all these things because
Hmm.
it's very very basic. So and as it was Daud had mentioned, in many cultures there is no difference between spirituality and life and health and religion. So we should not be completely thinking that one aspect of population experience is applicable to all. I'm not saying it's all good. Definitely, we need to find the evidence because
Sure.
that is what our faith wants us. And we need to do more research. We need to do more community-based research, engaging communities in different regions, and inclusive research in different, not only traditional religions and or not only the mainland religions, but also traditional faiths, etc. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's interesting because what you say about traditional religion, I think, is right. 'Cause I've been doing some work recently alongside Indigenous communities in relation to mental health, and there's some fantastic things that we can share if we just are open enough to have these conversations. So, thank you, David. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with my co-panelists and without evidence, because evidence is the only language of science. Without evidence, we cannot claim anything because we don't. It might be work with one person, but not work with others. So
Mm,
evidence is important. And when it comes, even so far the researches which I come across, especially when I was preparing this webinar,
yes.
there are a number of research related to Islam and mental health, spirituality, all this. But all these and researches, they were all focusing on spirituality angle on mental health, on and mental health, not the religion. Because when it comes for Islam, as I described it before, spirituality is the highest level. So once you reach the highest level, they are claiming that your mental health will be sound,
Right.
and you cannot go with highest level without going through the other two level. So there were one of research which I can mention a little bit, though I know we don't have much time. That research was talking about positive psychology and on Islamic perspective. So it was done in Iran, at Tehran. So they took three aspects of positive psychology and attachment and secure attachment, hope and optimism. So then they concluded in Islam, if you reach to make a secure based on Allah, then your thinking will be positive, and every angle of stress or worried death and all these will become something which will not be a much concern. So in that way they said the person will be and helpful, and there are some other also researches which have done.
Hmm.
And nowadays, mainly in Islam, a group which I mentioned before, and International Islamic Psychological Associations, they are the ones who are doing much about Islam and psychology and mental health. Though still it's a new and new, but they are doing really a much and much a great work, which can even introduce and psychology to Muslims. Because I also come across some other research which are saying Muslim societies are the least who experience cognitive behavioral therapy
Oh,
or mental health services because they are a bit resistant.
mhm.
So I think it can become a window which can introduce real psychology to these societies.
That's great. That's really good. So we need science, but we also need interpersonal relationships, because sometimes science can measure some things, but actually there are things that go on in the smaller dimensions of our lives that are fundamentally important. Julie.
I just want to add something to that because a lot of the studies that have been conducted are qualitative as opposed to quantitative in this space. And so I think we can have evidence by listening to people's stories and narratives.
Yeah.
And so I do think evidence is important. I do think it muddies the water when we try to put a square peg into a round hole. But there is a way to get the information that we want to get just by, as you just mentioned, speaking to people and having those conversations and recognizing what are the pieces and parts of their rituals that they use that do positively impact their mental health, and sharing that then with the greater community. So
Yeah.
just wanted to add.
No, that's great. I think that's fundamentally important, because there's a big difference between giving somebody a diagnosis and listening to the personal story that emerges from that experience. So that's really important. Great. Good. Well, the next thing that we're talking about, diagnosis. Next thing I want us to think about is the relationship between faith and psychiatry. So psychiatry has a checkered history with relation to mental health, uh, thanks partly to Freud's influence, and but partly to many other things. Um, First of all, what do you think? Uh, why do you think psychiatrists or psychiatry has a problem with faith? And importantly, how can we overcome that problem? Who will I choose? Daud, if you could begin with that one, please.
And to me, I can say, though I think it will be, and Dr. Julie and Manoj will be better for me. But if I and think about from my perspective, and even especially the perspective of the society which I am living with, and one, the psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist are not familiar with the religion, what will happen? And they took blindly about science, then what will happen is the dichotomy will start. People are conservative, more religion, they are thinking everything evolved around and religion. And this person is feeling that he is science, he is someone who knows everything, and he is someone who want to cure, and you have a fixed criteria. Then what will happen? That dichotomies will start. Some people who maybe fit the criteria of psychosis or paranoia can become a religious experience, which the whole society are accepted, and statistically, which will become a normal. So I think the problem is coming when you either you were running from the religion, or you are not familiar with the religion. Because when and split was started was when the religious abuses were there, and the scientists they start to disconnect and divorce from the religion.
Mm.
So if it's in that, yes, but always the problem is when, like Dr. Julia said, you are not seeing the perspective of the people which you are living with. That's what making these dichotomous.
Great. Manoj?
Yes, I think there is a. It's I think primarily the on the formation. It depends a lot on the formation, and most of the scientific training for the psychiatrists do not acknowledge the role of faith communities, which are huge. It's huge, and they are present, and unfortunately, there is a mutual suspicion, and there's not enough dialogue. We need dialogue because we need psychiatrists to understand the realities of communities, as Daud was saying. You can't. You have to begin from where people are. Now, if people say that if a person says I have been possessed, you can't go about trying to disprove that there is no possession.
No.
You have to go to their level and try to figure out how can they be helped in their situation. It doesn't matter whether it is scientifically proven or true or not true. And so this is a big problem, and I think the only way it can be solved is that we need faith communities to be more open, and the mental health professionals to be open, and there needs to be dialogue, and we need to learn from each other and respectfully learn from each other. It's very important because mental health professionals alone cannot solve the problem. There are too few of them. And faith communities have huge numbers, and we need to equip them as Julie had done. That's the only way forward. And we need dialogue, we need discussion, and we need to overcome the prejudices and genuine problems because of lack of knowledge among faith communities that we actually can do damage while we can actually be very helpful.
That's great. Thank you. Julie?
I'm going to say exactly what he said. Thank you, Manoj. I think so. One of the quotes that we got in a research study that we were conducting was that professionals are not talking about faith, and pastors are not talking about mental health, and so it really does go from both directions. And so that is something that we've worked a, a lot with, right? Because when it's again speaking from the U.S. perspective, there are certain things that you don't really discuss. Where you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about money, um, and so those things impact people's mental health. So you really do have to talk about those things in the professional space, and that becomes an important piece of the recognizing how people are struggling, so meeting people where they're at. I also want to add something around just the field of psychiatry in general, that I think is a contributing factor. And again, speaking to what's happened in the United States, oftentimes the policies and processes, we use the DSM, right, in addition to ICD-9, but we also use the DSM for diagnosis of mental health conditions. And there's research that demonstrates that around the time of the civil rights movement, they did an edification of the DSM from DSM-1 to DSM-2, and the actual description of certain diagnoses changed based on what was happening in society at the time. And so the description for schizophrenia prior to civil rights was somebody who was, it was mostly women who were hospitalized, probably for postpartum depression, looking at, they just could not function in their family home. But post civil rights, they added language around aggression, and after the civil rights, the DSM-2 came out, there was like a 60% increase in Black men being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So pre-post, and then that kind of made its way into the field of psychiatry in the U.S. And still today, there's a 7% increase in Black men being diagnosed with schizophrenia over white men. And so what's happening in society, I think, impacts the field of psychiatry.
That's interesting.
And so to take that in as an overlay to how does that, so when somebody comes to you and they're talking about their religious beliefs, what's happening in society impacts the way that they're going to be diagnosed or misdiagnosed. So I think, again, it's kind of like overlaying science onto
Yes.
religion, to like your previous question almost, like, are we putting too much evidence around
Yeah,
the religious space or the spiritual space?
that's a great point. Daud.
Yeah, briefly, I want to add one thing. And sometimes if you are familiar with the religion, it can help you, like Dr. and Manoj have mentioned it. It will help you because, and before coming back to Somaliland and start my clinic, I took a certificate of Islamic psychology, which was a 5-day seminar, intensive seminar. In that way, I have learned about what Dr. Minaj was talking about, possession and black magic and all this, and how it can help us. This and what are their interpretation in Islam, how we can integrate with our practice. So when I came, mostly the first question which they will ask you, the people, is, do you believe that black magic is there? Do you believe that the and possession is there? So you cannot say, because it's in the Islam, you cannot say I don't believe. But within that certificate, we have learned it will reduce the stigma,
Right.
because the people will accept black magic and possession. It's a common. And if you see, for the religious and scholars who are dealing with this, their clinic are very huge comparing to us. So we realize it by accepting that and integrating it with therapy, then it can become more acceptable and more. And so it's really helpful when you understood, like when the both doctors said to your society.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And so it seems, I think the cultural dimension you're talking about, Julie, that would be a discussion in itself, that interface between how we create mental health challenges and how that psychiatry and all of us respond to that. But it seems to me what we're saying is, at minimum, uh, uh, religious communities need to have education. We need to think differently about their theology, particularly a theology of constantly blaming people for their own illnesses. Psychiatrists and psychologists need to have this on the horizon, part of their educational processes, in order that we can understand what the positives and the negatives of that connection across cultures. I think Dowd's points is fundamentally important. So that's really, really helpful. So one last question. That's to do with spiritual abuse and mental health. So there is, as we've seen, a lot of good evidence that faith is good for your health. But there are aspects of faith that are not good for your health, and there are communities which can be very detrimental to your health. So the question is a simple one. What safeguards should be in place to ensure that religious institutions support rather than harm well-being? What do we do? And I'll begin with you, Manoj, if that's okay.
Yes, this is very true, and this is very true with all professions, all services that society provides. To people who are very vulnerable. It could be children, teachers, taking care of children who have vulnerabilities. It could be doctors taking care of people who are sick, and same thing, people of faith, the pastors, priests, and religious folks who have authority. People come to them with tremendous vulnerabilities and needs. So that is why, in all these situations, you also find examples of abuse. Abuse of children, abuse of in health professions, lawyers.
Yeah.
So whoever has power, and when people are vulnerable, there's abuse. So how do we? The specific question is, how do you actually prevent this abuse? One is to actually to is to make a democratization of faith, is to remove the gatekeepers and to allow people to develop their own agency. Each faith has those possibilities. You can be a follower of different faiths, and you can actually learn more. You need guidance from authorities, but you have to be more independent and interconnected. And so, of course, self-care, I'm not saying that self-care is only taking care of yourself. It's also part of it is also taking care of others. You have to be interconnected, but there needs to be an accountability that the followers are equipped to face it. And the other is we have to develop a culture of tremendous openness and safe and sacredness of these spaces. So that we have to have codes of conduct, we need confidentiality. So there's a lot of work that we need to do when and set up very high standards and zero tolerance of abuse. So when we talk about these things and not sweep it under the carpet, then we are able to succeed, because these are very precious spaces, and faith can really help in its best form.
Yes.
But of course, it has its real chances of abuse. So we need to use tested and proven methodologies of openness, depending on agency, and also making sure that we have standards and codes of conduct, and to ensure safe and sacred spaces.
That's great. Thank you, Manoj. Daud, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think it's really and something which we all have seen, that the abuse of religion and related to mental health. And but to me, when it comes for Muslims or Islam per se, and as such abuse I haven't seen. But the problem is the Muslims, when they cherry pick and practice based on their culture. Because the reason why I'm saying that, you can see a different and practice of Islam with the different countries or cultures. I have done all my education in Pakistan. I have been there in Pakistan for 13 years. So comparing to Pakistan and Somalis, you can see a difference. Though both are Muslims, but their practicing of Islam is different.
Right.
So, and even the abuses which happening are different. So in that way, I have concluded it's not the Islam per se, and even the Muslims are in the West. They are different from the Muslims are in the East.
Sure.
Those all are Muslims. So I have checked why some and Muslims are abusing the religion in the side of mental health more, and the others are not. So that the determinant which came was education. Their level of education is the one which is mainly making and less abuse on the religion, while those who are less educated, means the society who are not developed in education, are more abused in the in religion. So one brief example, if I give, for the Somalis, some, or we can say predominantly, they believe that Muslims and they don't experience depression. If you are Muslim, it's a non-Muslim problem. It's not a Muslim problem. So for those, they accept diabetes are something can happen to the Muslim. But if we go back maybe and 60 or 80 years, some of the and Somalis, they were resistant to get and student to their children to school, because they were saying that in school, if you go to school, you will become a non-Muslim. It's a non-Muslim system. So, in my humble conclusion is, where education is low, especially education related to mental health, then that gap is filled by the religious scholars who are not well equipped on mental health and latest science.
Yeah.
Then the abuse will be more. While even if you go back the time of you can say the golden age of Muslims have contributed to mental health a lot. because that time science were not isolated from the religion. Science were integrated. Even in the mosque, geography were studying in the mosque, history, philosophy, all science were teaching in the mosque. So that in a conclusion, I can say the problem is the lack of knowledge and education, what making people to abuse the religion more.
That's great. Thank you. Julie?
I agree. I agree with the Abdifatah just said. I think from my perspective, what we need to focus on, because you asked, how do we protect against it? So education definitely is one way. I think also community. Because I think the people that are closest to the people that are potentially being abused need to recognize what's happening, whether it's being involved in some kind of a cult or ritualistic practices, to stand in. But I think the challenge is, abuse sometimes is in the eye of the beholder. So what faith, what one particular faith community practices for some people may seem abusive, and for others may seem part of our practice.
Yeah.
And so, it's difficult. Like I was involved in a situation, there was an earthquake in Haiti, and many of the people from Haiti were allowed to come over into the United States because if there was like I forget, I'm trying to think, a sanctuary where, there was like opportunity to come over to address the challenges if they had like somebody in the US that they could come and stay with. And so a family came over, and the young person, child, was in the home when his uncle passed away from the earthquake. So he witnessed his uncle dying. 10-year-old boy, he ended up going into American school. So this little child who had just experienced trauma is now in a school where they're not even speaking his native language. And he was struggling significantly. And he was psychotic. So at school, they called the authorities and had him sent to the hospital to get treatment. And Western medicine doesn't necessarily, jive with Haitian culture. So they offered him medication, which upon discharge from the hospital, mom said, we're not doing that because that's not part of our culture. So he continued to be psychotic, went back to school, threw a desk at a teacher, back to the hospital. And this went around in circles until somebody called the authorities, the state, to say this child is being abused or neglected because they're not using the Western medicine. And so there was a threat to take the child out of the family home. And that's when I got involved in the situation. And what the mother wanted, the mother believed that when the uncle passed away, the uncle's spirit went into the child. And that's why he was hearing voices. And so the solution to that is not taking psychotropic medication for that family. Which is against their beliefs, So what's abusive? Was it abusive that they weren't giving him the medication? Was it abusive that the U.S. was trying to give him medication or going to take him away from his family? You know what I mean? There's so many different ways to look at this situation. So as a team, we decided that we would have the I'm drawing a blank on the name, but somewhat of we would call it an exorcism, like a religious process to try to remove the spirit from the child, and brought in, somebody that could perform that, a Haitian expert that could perform, a faith leader that could perform the action to try to see if it would help the child. But the mother also agreed she wanted to stay in the U.S. So if this did not work, then she would try some of therapy and medication to try to alleviate the child's experience. It did not work, sadly.
Wow.
We were all hoping that it would. And the child was involved in therapy and was able to deal with some of the trauma. But there are so many different ways to look at what is abusive in just a simple situation like that.
That's great. Well, that was very rich, so thank you very much for that. Now we're coming up towards the end of our time. We've got some interesting questions. but we don't quite have space to follow them through just now. So what we'll do is we will continue the discussion around the questions on Circle. So your questions that you've asked will certainly be responded to. We have one more thing before we begin to move towards the end. There's a short piece of video from one of our panelists that couldn't manage. We'd like to show that just now, just before we get into our closing comments.
When you talk about faith and religion in the current day world, right? When faith and religion in the world, right? When about faith and religion in the current day world, right? When faith and religion in combination have become such very powerful entities, especially when you talk about faith and religion in the current day world, right? When faith and religion in combination have
Okay, that's fine. Well, unfortunately, it looks like the video isn't quite working. So we'll share that in Circle as well. So the wisdom of that will certainly come to you. Right, panelists, I have one more thing that I need you to do. If each of you could complete this sentence, I think that'd be helpful just to tie things together. So I'll begin with you, Manoj. The role of religion and mental health in our changing world is what?
The role of religion in mental health in our changing world, I think, is to remain relevant and valuable by creating safe, caring, and supporting communities that actually promote mental health in close dialogue and cooperation with mental health professionals.
Great, thank you. Julie?
The role of religion in mental health in our changing world is to offer opportunities for resilience, to create communities,
Yeah.
To continue to create valuable third spaces that are welcoming to all.
Fantastic, thank you. Daud?
And the role of religion in mental health for our changing world is very essential, which according to the hardness theory and the 3C of controlling and stress management. According to that theory, today the changing world is very essential to have religion, which will give a sense of commitment, control, and seeing the challenges of the world as a challenge, not and as a obstacle or threat, which increase the resilience individually and collectively.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. That's been a really rich and helpful conversation. I feel I've learned a lot and I feel I've gained some new friends. So thank you for that. And thank you for everybody for taking the space out of your day or your evening to be with us around these important issues, to talk around these important issues. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's not an end of a conversation, but the things that we've talked about today, I think we've got to continue to talk about them. Like each one of the sections that we looked at, we could have an hour-long seminar on each of them. So there's so much to do, but it's so exciting to be able to do it. So I just want to encourage you to continue engaging on the Circle platform. And as I say, we'll deal with the questions that came out of this session then. I just want to finish by saying I feel hopeful. I feel positive about this conversation. I know we're going in a good direction and I'm looking forward to the future. So I wish each of you every blessing.